Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexandra Papaikonou. Before we start the webinar, I would like to run through a few logistics for the webinar. Please note that your lines have been muted. If you have any questions throughout the entire presentation, please type them in the chat section located within the control panel. Usually it's towards the very bottom. If you come across any issues throughout the webinar, please send a direct message to myself, TRC host, within the chat section. So let's begin. On behalf of Partners in Project Green and our webinar partners, Toronto Hydro and Resource and Hydro on Brampton, I would like to thank you. And thank you for joining our monthly series of green technology webinars. Partners in Project Green is a growing community of businesses working together to green their bottom line by creating an internationally recognized eco-business zone around Toronto Pearson that is known for its competitive, high performance, and eco-friendly business climate. Through these monthly webinars, we hope to bring the latest technologies, programs, and tools to the comfort of your office and to provide a format to ask questions that will help you discover the right solutions for your operations. Partners in Project Green offers many resources to help companies along their journey to sustainability, and I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our programs, training events, and much more at www.partnersinprojectgreen.com. So this afternoon, we're exploring the very interesting topic of the new waste management strategy that will be coming out very soon. We are very fortunate to have Ange Dominski and John Armiento, both from the Ministry of the Environment, calling in from Toronto this afternoon to make us more aware of what's to come. First up, we have Ange Dominski. He's the Director of the Ministry of the Environment Sector Compliance Branch. His team is responsible for the development and implementation of sector-based environmental compliance programs. A particular note is a dedicated team of 10 environmental officers who enforce the Ministry's 3 Rs regulations for the IC&I waste. Ange has been with the Ministry for over 31 years, where he has held various positions including the Director of the Waste Management Policy Branch, Manager of the Environmental Assessment Project Coordination Section, and Manager of Waste Approvals. He is a professional engineer with a master's degree in environmental engineering. So you could take it on, Ange.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for showing an interest in the 3 Rs and waste reduction. Actually, my speech is going to be more on the practical side of recycling to show that it makes sense for business, and then to talk a little bit about the current regulations that we have on the books for the Ministry of the Environment around the 3 Rs. Hopefully, with this today, you'll see these regulations in a different light, and don't see them as things that you're required to do, but things that you should be doing. So on your screen now, you'll see a picture of a very simplified picture of a typical manufacturing business. On the left-hand side, materials, and they could be non-hazardous materials, or they can be hazardous materials like some toxic substances. You have your water, electricity, fuel, and then you have things to keep the business running, office supplies, and building materials. Those are things that tend to cost you money. Similarly, on the right-hand side, the bottom right-hand side, you have outputs from the manufacturing business, kind of undesirable outputs. You have non-hazardous wastes. You have subject wastes, which could be liquid industrial wastes or hazardous wastes, air emissions, and wastewater. Again, these are areas that cost you money to run your businesses. There are disposal costs for waste materials, there's sewer charges, there's money that's spent on air emissions control and wastewater control. And at the top of the diagram is your products, and that's where you make money. So ideally, you're going to try and reduce the money you spend in order to maximize your profits. This is a very simplified diagram. I'm sure everybody's business is slightly different and thing. So with this as a kind of a background, let's take a look at the first of the 3 Rs, and that's reducing. And if we look at some of the areas of the inputs, raw materials. A lot of money or a lot of raw materials end up as waste because they're not properly used, or they may be expired materials, or they're end cuts, things that you didn't quite need to use. By looking at proper inventory control, oftentimes there's a good way of reducing the amount of waste. You know, if you have a lot of expired materials, you might think about your purchasing. Are we buying too much stuff and letting it sit there and expire or rot or rust or whatever happens to it? On the electrical fuel or water electrical fuel and stuff, a lot of simple controls and things and good practices can significantly reduce the amount of those materials that you use. Motion sensors, timed lighting, reducing the temperature in your building if it's a little high, energy efficient bulbs, high efficiency furnace, lots of little areas that you can review and see if there's possible ways to save. On office supplies, very simple little things, simple, again, inventory control. We in our office implemented more of a kind of a lock and key on our office supplies, and you wouldn't believe how much you use less when somebody has to come and ask for some new pens or new paper and that kind of stuff. So there's a few examples in the reduced area. I'd like to now just take an actual look at a cost avoidance of a simple, by controlling spills in your plant. You know, if you have a spill, even a minor spill in your plant, think of all the things, the costs that may be associated with that thing. First of all, you've got a lost material, a lost raw material or product. Then, you know, you've got to pay somebody either internally to clean it up, or if it's a larger spill, you may have to hire an environmental service company to clean it up. Again, costs there associated. You know, if you've got on-site materials for cleaning it up, a cleanup kit or kitty litter or whatever you might use to clean up spills, again, cost there. Once those things the material is collected, it's no longer a valued product or material, so there's disposal costs. And lastly, if there's significant spills, there could be, you know, fines imposed by the Ministry of the Environment. So all of those, that simple spill results in a lot of costs, which ends up as lost products. So, you know, implementing some very simple measures, sometimes in the plant, spill containment, to prevent spills, or at least capture them before they become costly environmental skills, can save your company a lot of money. Just like to give you a kind of a practical example. We were doing a lot of work in the tooling and machining sector a couple of years ago, and we visited a lot of plants. One of the plants was recapturing all their cutting fluids that they use in the machining operations, simply by spill trays and returning that into a reservoir, cleaning it up, and then reusing it. Good example of reducing the need for new materials. Second company was, this stuff was being lost, sprayed all over the floor. They were buying endless bags of kitty litter type absorbent, spreading it all around, collecting it up every so often, putting it in drums and barrels, and disposing of it. The material happened to be a subject waste, which had to go for costly disposal. So, you know, again, by making some process changes where you're capturing some of the material and reusing it or reducing the need for new materials, great idea, enhances the profits and is a good business sense. Let's look at then the second R, reuse. Some on the slide there you'll see just some very simple examples. There's, you know, every process, every industry is very different, and there's many different ways and different things you can do. But just some, you know, oftentimes they're very simple things that over the years can add up to a lot of savings. Here we've got some simple examples of reusing water, where a retailer was collecting condensate from the refrigeration units and air conditioning systems and using it to irrigate for landscaping. A truck wash center was recycling the water instead of sewering it, just cleaning it up and recycling it. I know a lot of the car washes now, that's common practice. On the waste process materials, you know, if you use solvents and they're dirty with paints and inks and stuff, they can be redistilled and reused. Materials can be returned back to the process. I mentioned the cutting, the tooling and machining example there. Cooling fluids, a lot of these things, antifreeze and stuff like that, there are means to now refurbish them, clean them up, add back some of their active materials and into them and refurbish them and reuse them. Again, on the office supplies, reusing stuff. We, as part of our greening initiative in our office, we also did an office clean out and asked everybody to go through their drawers and pull up all their pens and rulers and excess stuff and return them to the supply cabinet if they were still usable. Amazing. We cut basically our usage of 50% on buying new office supplies. So it's tremendous, little savings, but it all adds up. The last I want to talk about is the recycle. On this page, there's just a few of the many recycling programs that are out there. A lot of these, some of the ministry ones under the Waste Diversion Act, they are geared at residential thing. But why I put them here is that they demonstrate that there are now, with these waste diversion programs, there are markets set up for a lot of these materials, and if they're set up for the residential area, certainly businesses can find the markets for these materials as well. We've got the Blue Box program, which is the paper and glass and bottles and all that kind of stuff. The Recycling Council of Ontario has set up a Take Back the Light program. But there's also for industry, there's a lot of good examples out there where one industry's waste can be used in another one's as a raw material. I've seen the steel slag that comes out of the primary steel plants, a company turning that into insulation. Pickle liquor, again from steel operation, is used as a wastewater treatment chemical. So there's a lot of examples in there, and there's probably hundreds of other ones. But again, to look at your waste products and identify if there's a good use that can be made of them. The next slide here just is, not only does it make good business sense, but there are, it does demonstrate some social responsibility and improve. There are global benefits. If we avoid landfilling, reducing air and water emissions that come from landfills, conserving our natural resources, saving energy, decreasing the emissions from your plant. The one thing I did want to specifically mention, though, is the driving innovative designs. A lot of the recycling and reusing programs and forcing people to look at new ways of doing business does drive a lot of innovative designs. And the green industry is a very growing industry in this province. And you'll often hear the politicians speak about trying to create new jobs and stuff through green industry. Next slide, here's just a pictorial of this that we borrowed from the Bloom Center site. That by reducing your environmental footprint, you reduce your business risk and increase your profitability. Okay, that gets me to the point where I'll talk about some of our ministry regulations that are requirements. We have fundamentally two regulations on the books that deal with the 3 R's. From the business sectors anyways. And that's Regulation 102 that requires you to complete a waste audit and prepare and implement a waste reduction work plan. Similarly, Regulation 103 requires you to set up the infrastructure to source separate certain regulated materials and ensure that they're sent off for recycling. The links there are links to these regulations, and I'll leave those with you that you can go to them at your leisure. These regulations do apply only to the larger facilities in certain sectors, and you'll see on your screen there the thresholds that the various sectors have to meet to be regulated. But I can't stress enough that, forget the regulation. This type of stuff is the right thing to do, and whether you're below the thresholds or above them, it does make good business sense to implement some of these programs. The next number of slides is going to be about some more details on these regulations. Here for a waste audit and a waste reduction work plan, they are required to be done annually. These things and what they involve is essentially looking at the waste that you produce, what sources they are, and ways of reducing them. They are required to be done annually, and I want to share a little story there why that makes a lot of good sense. We did a resweep. We inspected a whole bunch of companies one year, and then 2 or 3 years later, we went back to look at those companies to kind of get the before and after picture. And the ones that had implemented this as an annual exercise and looking at their waste and looking at new ways of reducing things significantly increased the amount of diversion that they had at their sites. Some of the examples were going from a 40% diversion up to a 50, 60, 70% diversion. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, less waste, increased profit. This slide is a little one on the waste, the whole planning process. And again, you know, starting with a waste audit, moving to a waste reduction work plan, implementing the plan, and then measuring the success. I won't spend a lot of time on that one as well. Regulation 103 is the kind of the physical regulation that requires you to set up the program, set up receptacles to receive the materials that are required to be source separated, implement and set up signage to educate the potential users of that, whether it's you know, blue bins in your office or bins out in the industrial area for recycling the metal. Also, it requires that you have an approved waste hauler to remove this waste from your material, and that you take you do your homework to ensure that this hauler is not just taking it to the landfill and dumping it, but it actually is taking that and finding the correct homes for those recycled materials. A question we often get is, do I have to have a bin for every different type of material? And the answer is no. That the materials that are required to be source separated can be commingled and sent to a waste management facility that will separate them there. So the next number of slides, which I'm just going to skip through quickly, are some of the specific requirements for the different sectors: office buildings, large manufacturing establishments, hotels, and these outline the materials that are required and the threshold again, retail establishments and complexes. That brings us over to slide number 20. So we, in the ministry, we've developed, in order to support these programs, we've also developed a bunch of toolkits in various sectors. And there is a link to that on our ministry website where you can find tips on how to do a better job, education materials. I think some of them have brochures and other material that you can put up in your place of businesses to promote this kind of activity. The Recycling Council of Ontario, I see there is a member that was signed up here. We've worked with them, we've provided some money to them to set up a new program called 3R Certified, where if you meet certain standards in this recycling business and doing a good job, you can be recognized for those efforts and be 3R certified. And again, there's a link there for more material and information on it. Finally, just to wrap up, the ministry does have guides and forms that are the regulated ones that need to be completed. There's some links there for that. And I'd also just want to quickly run through the last couple of slides, is that there are a number of other things that you should be aware of. Not only are there 3 R's, but in order to ensure your business is in compliance with the ministry regulations, you should become familiar with the approval requirements, the environmental compliance approvals, or a new program that we have that certain activities can simply be registered with the ministry. Heating systems, standby power in certain sectors are coming online. More is under development every day. If you take water, you may be required to take a permit to take water if you take it from a natural source, not the municipal systems. There is the Toxics Reduction Act. If you use certain toxic materials, you're required to, again, look at ways of reducing the use and creation of those materials. There are air pollution regulations that require you to meet certain standards and demonstrate that you, through modeling, that you've met these standards. And there are the waste management regulations that require registration of subject liquid and hazardous waste, that require treatment prior to disposal of that waste in a landfill, and has a number of other requirements about waste storage and reporting. So that's the end of my talk here. And at the end, I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you so much, Ange. We're going to go right into the new policy that's coming out. We have John Armiento, Manager for Waste Diversion under the Waste Management Policy Branch. John has been with the Ministry of the Environment for 25 years, focusing on provincial waste diversion and management policy. Key areas of his experience include overseeing waste diversion initiatives, including provincial diversion programs for blue blocks, municipal hazardous or special waste, waste electrical and electronic equipment, and used tires, as well as overseeing Ontario's hazardous waste policy. John has a degree in chemical engineering from the University of Toronto. So I'm just going to hand over, if you could just excuse us for a quick second, if we can just transition here. And I'm going to unmute you right now, John. There we go.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra. So Ange, thank you very much for that presentation. That, I think, is a nice sense of what the ministry's current regulations are with respect to the 3 Rs, and how the ministry works with industry and trying to ensure that companies can not only do the right thing, the legal thing, but also the right thing. What I'd now like to talk about is proposed legislation that the ministry has put out, and I just want to go through that legislation with you very quickly. I'm going to go through my slides. There's a lot of information in detail here. I'm going to try to go through these slides fairly quickly, and if there are any questions specific to either what I'm presenting or anything broader that the ministry might be dealing with respect to the waste diversion, please feel free to ask those questions. So again, I'm going to provide a detailed overview of the proposed Waste Reduction Act, but at a fairly high level. And I'm also going to be talking about the draft waste reduction strategy, which goes along with the proposed legislation. To give you a little background, why are we doing this? What's the context here? Broadly speaking, there is a need for action in this province to improve waste reduction, reuse, and recycling. Ontario's overall diversion rate is 25%. It's basically been at that level for several years now, and we do need to move forward and get better results in the province. The creation of new disposal sites like landfills and incinerators is very expensive, takes a lot of money, and generally speaking, it's not a desirable activity. There are very few people who support this. There's growing pressure on municipal financing and funding, and spending this money on waste disposal and diversion for municipalities and taxpayers is getting harder and harder to do, so we're looking for other ways of finding that funding. As well, there are, or have been, and continue to be concerns with eco-fees that consumers often experience when they purchase new products. Very often, they have no idea that there is a fee until they actually go to pay for whatever they're buying, and then they receive a surprise at the cash register. So that's a growing concern that we'd like to address. As well, there are ongoing stakeholder concerns that the existing legal framework around waste diversion needs to be reformed, that there are some issues that need to be changed. So those are the challenges that the province faces. There are a lot of opportunities as well with increasing diversion. In particular, it does attract investment to the province and does result in the creation of new jobs. Ange had mentioned green jobs earlier, and that's absolutely absolutely true. We've seen that with every new diversion program we've introduced in the province, as well as fostering innovation and of course the conservation of natural resources. Anytime you recycle or reuse a product, it means you don't have to go and use new resources to create new products. In addition, recycling generally uses far less energy than creating a new product from scratch. It also results in fewer greenhouse gas emissions. In general, environmental impacts are reduced. And the last opportunity is that we do have a significant opportunity to recover the economic value in the waste, particularly in the industrial, commercial, and institutional sectors. And this is something that a number of studies, not only in Ontario but throughout the world, have shown that when you do aggressively pursue the 3 R's, the additional economic value, I guess, to the economy is far, far more significant than the actual cost of recycling, with all the additional sort of side economic opportunities, as well as the fact that you're no longer just spending money getting rid of and paying for landfill costs and other tipping fees that are typically associated with waste disposal. So all of that money goes into the economy, so to speak. Oh, I seem to not be able to move to my next slide. Oh, there we go. A little bit of background as well. So Ontario has proposed a new waste reduction framework, new legislation called the Waste Reduction Act, and that was introduced this June, that just passed. And its intent is to increase waste diversion in the province and to, as I kind of mentioned, to protect consumers as well from surprise eco fees. The proposed waste reduction framework is based on a principle of individual producer responsibility, in which individual producers would be responsible for achieving environmental outcomes that the government would set on a product-by-product basis. And I'll speak a little bit more in the next couple of slides. But specifically, the proposed framework is intended to increase the recycling of waste in the province. It stimulates the reduction of waste as well, makes the individual producer responsible, as I just mentioned, for end-of-life management of its products or packaging, provides consumers with convenient and accessible waste diversion services, reduces the amount of waste sent to landfill, shifts the costs of diversion away from what is traditionally a municipal tax base to the producers of the products, protects the consumer from eco fees, and will provide a strong oversight and compliance activity to ensure that the legislation is met. Broadly speaking, we are introducing not only a Waste Diversion Act, but we're also introducing, or we have a document called the Waste Reduction Strategy. That's a sort of a companion document that provides the blueprint for how Ontario sees increased diversion happening over the next few years, both through the legislation that we're proposing as well as other activities. And I'll speak to that later on. So I'm just going to now go through some of the key elements of the legislation. The first element is the Waste Reduction Authority. So the proposed legislation is planning on having an authority oversee this legislation. And that authority is going to be a transformation of the current Waste Reduction Ontario organization, which some of you may be familiar with. That would be over time transformed into a new authority. The authority would be responsible for providing oversight and compliance with the proposed producer responsibility legislation. So they will be the organization that will undertake oversight and compliance. It will not be, the proposal is that the government will not be doing that oversight, which and compliance, which is what I think most of you would normally be used to seeing. In addition, the authority would engage in activities that it agrees to with the minister. So there would be an agreement that would set out essentially some of the activities we expect it to undertake. And some of its key functions under this legislation, just briefly, it would receive and store information from producers. It would assess the performance of producers' actions as required by legislation. It would take graduated compliance and enforcement action where necessary. It would also advise the government on specific issues as requested by the minister. It could facilitate disputes, dispute resolution between producers and municipalities related to any necessary compensation that municipalities would require for managing wastes. And it would report to the minister and the public on results of activities on an annual basis. In addition, the authority is self-funding. It's not funded by government. It would be funded through its activities, and it would have the ability to charge and set fees. The Act itself provides oversight and transparency provisions for that authority. As I said, the authority is required to annually report to the minister on results. The Act also allows the minister to require that the authority establish advisory councils as necessary so that it could seek input from stakeholders on whatever issues are necessary or the minister would advise or ask for advice on. As well, the minister could issue policy direction to the authority where necessary and where it's in the public interest. The minister could, if necessary, require a review of the authority. And these are just some provisions that, that are in place to ensure that there is a proper, I guess, oversight and accountability for this authority. The minister could, under special circumstances, also appoint an administrator who could take over for the authority. Again, this is an emergency sort of power that we don't necessarily envision using, but we put in place just in case. And the minister could ask the Auditor General to audit the authority as well to ensure that it's operating in a cost-effective manner. And lastly, the minister could prohibit the authority from, or the legislation does prohibit the authority from establishing any subsidiary corporations or engaging in a commercial activity. Essentially, the authority has its roles defined, and that's what it's supposed to do. It can't create any side businesses. I'd like to speak quickly about the individual responsibilities for producers under the legislation. Essentially, producers under this legislation would be responsible for meeting whatever outcomes related to the 3 R's that are set either in the Act or through a regulation. These could include things like waste reduction standards. For example, recycling targets could be established for producers that they need to meet. You know, if you sell X widgets, you might need to recycle 50, 70%, et cetera, whatever is set by regulation. Producers would also have to meet any service standards for consumer accessibility and convenience that would be set up or are required by regulation. So this could be something like ensuring that consumers all across the province would have access to facilities, not just facilities in, say, the Greater Toronto area or just in densely populated areas. So it's just to ensure fairness across the province. And in addition, producers may have requirements with respect to how they promote and educate consumers with respect to whatever recycling activities they put in place. Producers would have options on how they meet these outcomes. So we're not going to be telling them how to ensure that the outcomes are met, the recycling targets, et cetera. We're just going to set the targets, set the requirements, and then producers will be able to achieve those targets in whatever way makes the most sense to them, whatever suits their business needs, or in whatever way they wish to do so. They can do so individually, which is why it's called individual producer responsibility, or they could join up with others or hire companies to help deliver their responsibilities. In some cases, we recognize producers may band together and essentially create companies for themselves, who the companies would operate on their behalf, and we call these created companies intermediaries or collectives, other people would sometimes call them. Producers can work with these intermediaries to meet their objectives or to meet their requirements. But they can also deal directly with waste management companies, for example, to deliver on their services, or with municipalities. The proposed act is drafted, is not intended to affect in any way the Competition Act and how that's applied. So clearly the act is intended to just place requirements that have to be met. It's not intended to in any way supersede or impede on competition in this province. In addition, producers and intermediaries have responsibilities if they do join up for meeting waste reduction and service standards. There would have to be an agreement, obviously, between these two parties if they do join together. But one thing I just wanted to explain or clarify is that if a producer signs an agreement with an intermediary, they cannot pass on their responsibilities to that intermediary. The producer always remains liable for its requirements. However, where an intermediary signs with the producer, the intermediary also would be responsible for what it has signed on for. So you would have joint liability where there is an agreement between those two bodies. Also, both producers and intermediaries would be required to register with the authority, the Waste Reduction Authority, on a registry and submit reports to the Waste Authority as well. And the Act as well provides reg-making authority for any requirements under it. And I just, for those of you who might be familiar with the Waste Diversion Act, regulations under that Act are minister's regulations. The regulations under this legislation, as proposed, are what are called Lieutenant Governor and Council, or regulations that require cabinet approval. So they're not just minister regulations. In this legislation, there is also a municipal role that's outlined. Essentially, municipalities that want to be involved in the collection of any designated wastes would need to register with the authority. They don't have to register, but if they do register, then they are entitled to producers would have an obligation to essentially compensate the municipality in a fair manner. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but essentially there's a process laid out in the legislation for how to establish what fair compensation is. The first step being through an agreement between the two. But there are provisions for establishing compensation formulas if they can't come to an agreement between the two of them. As well, I had mentioned early on that there is a requirement with respect to eco-fees in this legislation. The Act requires that there be all-in pricing with respect to products, and that the all-in pricing includes any environmental costs or eco-fees associated with that product. So a producer or seller of any product has to include the recycling costs in the cost of the product when it's displayed in any way to the consumer. The producer, though, or seller, can choose to communicate the recycling cost to the consumer. So there is definitely the ability to identify what a recycling cost might be if that's what the retailer or the producer wants to do. But it has to do so in a way that ensures that the price includes that recycling cost. So just to clarify, if there's any confusion around this point, it means when you see a price, that price has to have the recycling cost in it, and it can't be a separate fee that is paid when you reach the register. It has, any advertised cost has to include the recycling cost in it. As well, the proposed act prohibits any false or misleading information with regard to what those recycling costs are. In other words, you can't say, well, this is a government tax, or you can't say that the cost is a certain amount when the actual recycling cost was only a fraction of that amount. It has to be inaccurate and you cannot mislead the consumer with respect to what those costs are. And the reason, again, these have been put in the legislation is to address eco-fee concerns that we have found in this province over the past several years with respect to our existing waste diversion programs. And the last point is that the authority would be responsible for any compliance and enforcement related to this integrated pricing piece. So again, it's not government who's enforcing, it is the waste authority that's being put in place. There is with respect to the enforcement that the authority undertakes, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. Again, it just wanted to make it clear that the authority has a set of tools that it could use for enforcement purposes, including inspection, seizure, compliance orders, and administrative penalties, and any offense provisions. And again, there's a fair bit of detail in the legislation about what those may be, what the powers are, how they could use them, and what remedies companies may have if there's any disagreement with the enforcement activities. With respect to existing waste diversion programs and industry funding organizations under the Waste Diversion Act, these will continue under the new legislation. So the 4 programs we currently have in place, Blue Box, Municipal Hazardous or Special Waste, Used Tires, and Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment, these would all remain in place when if the act is passed. However, the intent is that they will all transition to the new framework over time. And we do have a schedule proposed in our waste strategy in terms of when we expect that to happen. So until they do transition, they will continue under the new legislation, but following the current rules of the Waste Diversion Act that is in place. With respect to the Waste Diversion Act, however, no new programs would be or could be created, and no new industry funding organizations can be created if this current act goes forward. In addition, all the roles and responsibilities under the Waste Diversion Act remain as they are, both with respect to the authority, industry funding organizations, and their collection and their operation of programs and collection of fees, and the ministry as the current enforcement body for that legislation, that would remain unchanged as well. And the other item I'm just going to flag for you is that under the proposed legislation, there would be a change to the existing funding cap for the Blue Box program. Currently in the Waste Diversion Act, industry producers are required to pay 50% of net costs of the Blue Box program, the municipal net costs. That cap, the 50% cap, will be removed. It can be increased, however, it would only be increased through regulation and consultation. So it's not going to change through the legislation, but the legislation does enable it to change should the government decide to do so. Just a few more small points about the existing programs and the existing IFOs. The proposed act does include provisions that facilitate the transition of existing programs and IFOs to the new responsibility, the new Waste Reduction Act, just to ensure that those transitions occur in a sort of smooth and transparent manner. Some of the provisions speak to enable the windup of existing industry funding organizations, allow for administrators to be appointed to help that transition, again, if it's in the public interest to do so, and it allows the government to make some regulations that would assist in the transfer of things like assets and liabilities of existing IFOs to the new framework. There are some other provisions as well in there in the legislation related to helping the wind down of existing programs. And for those of you who are familiar with industry stewardship plans, there are some small changes that are being proposed to the legislation around industry stewardship plans, but essentially nothing is changing, and any industry stewardship plans that are either in place or are being proposed can continue under the proposed framework. Just want to speak quickly to the proposed waste reduction strategy, the companion document to the legislation. So the strategy also has been released for comment, and we have been looking for feedback on what's being proposed in there. As I mentioned, it provides a blueprint on implementing the proposed act as well. It includes timelines for the transition of programs, existing programs, for the designation of any new products, and also it includes a bunch of supporting measures, not only for the legislation, but in support of increased diversion in the province. I'm just going to go to the next slide. The next slide gives a sense of what some of the key elements of the strategy are and what some of the timelines are. So again, one of the key areas, and definitely an area of concern for a lot of folks, is the Blue Box program. The proposed strategy indicates that the transition of the Blue Box program is going to take several years. That's what we anticipate, and it will be done in a very careful and fully consultative manner. We're going to be doing a lot of we're going to have a lot of consultation and discussions with affected stakeholders, municipalities, et cetera, to ensure that any change to the Blue Box program under the legislation is not going to result in any disruption of what we all have come to know and are familiar with respect to the actual operation of the Blue Box program. As far as the other programs are concerned, again, we essentially expect the other three programs to transition. What we're proposing right now is that we'd probably transition the electronics program first, MHSW program after that, and then sometime around 4 years after the legislation comes into place, we would expect the used tire program to transition. We're also proposing that the first new material to be regulated under this legislation is industrial, commercial, and institutional paper and packaging. So essentially, it would be the Blue Box program, but for industry as opposed to residents. And again, that would involve a fairly involved consultation process before we actually put something like that in place, because we do recognize how large an undertaking that is. And in addition, we would begin a review of the 3Rs regulations, the ones that Ange had talked about earlier, to ensure that they are still appropriate, and B, to identify if any changes might need to be made to assist with the implementation of an IC&I paper and packaging requirement. We're also looking at and proposing that we develop some standards for end-of-life vehicles. And we are looking at and seeking comments on other materials that we'd like to put under the new framework with respect to diversion. Some of the things we are identifying right now is perhaps carpets or additional electronics products that we haven't included. And then over time, other wastes such as organics, non-food related organic waste, or large bulky items like mattresses and furniture. These could all be new wastes that we would add over time. We're also looking at the possibility of disposal bans that could be put in place to support the diversion of all materials under this framework. Some of the early ones we're thinking of is perhaps a disposal ban on electronics once the electronics program is transitioned to the new framework, and then maybe the household hazardous wastes once they are transitioned, and other programs as well. bans on other materials once they're transitioned. So it would be all stepwise, but we would consult on any disposal bans before they happen to A, determine if they're appropriate, and B, how they would be implemented to ensure the least disruption to consumers and industry. And the last piece that we're proposing is to increase the diversion of organics broadly, and we would be working on and consulting on a strategy for organics diversion. We expected that to be a fairly longer-term process. However, we have had a lot of feedback during the past few months in which there are strong calls for an organics diversion program to be established much quicker, and so that that maybe change some of the thinking as well along these lines. So that's it. As far as
John, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Is there any last thoughts that you want to share with us? And we can
No. I'm on my last slide, and I'll just wrap it up. So the last slide basically indicates that we have had consultation. We've had plenty of feedback over the summer. Our formal consultation has ended, and we've had over 180 comments. We've completed a number of individual sessions with stakeholders across the province. However, we are still open to and are receiving comments and are willing to meet with individual stakeholders. So the consultation is not done yet, but the formal consultation is over. So with that, I'm done, and I'll open it up to any Q's and A's.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to unmute right now, Ange. And if we can go back to the slide, I think that was the one right before. John, I think that was really useful for everyone. Yes. Ange, I've just unmuted you. I think the first question we have is towards Ange. In the first presentation, you indicate that we've kind of been stagnant at 25% reduction in our wastes. How do we compare overall to the other provinces?
So I think,
John, you might have some information on that.
I do. Stats Canada puts out a report every 2 years, and they just released a report just about a month ago that does compare diversion across the country. Ontario compares relatively well. I believe we are 4th among provinces, and that's pretty much where we've been for some time now. Again, it does reflect the fact that we haven't changed much.
Mm-hmm. And then we kind of go into another question here. What is the poorest diversion rate for a specific sector? Is it maybe the IC&I sector, residential, or is there another sector that's the poorest in diversion?
Again, I can speak to that. So residential waste is far and away the most successful area of diversion in the province. We're well over 40% diversion on residential waste, mainly because of the Blue Box program and a lot of organics recycling that occurs through many municipalities. With respect to IC&I, we're according to the Stats Canada results, we are doing fairly poorly, on average about 11 or 12% diversion.
Within the sectors, I think what we find in the field is that the construction and demolition area is probably not one of the best areas that is recycling. And I think a lot of there's a lot of smaller projects that fall below the radar screen of our thresholds. And in those areas, the common practice is you drive around the cities and you see the renovations going on, everything into a bin and the bin into the landfill.
Yep.
Okay. Just a quick second here. I lost my place. What is the direct impact, or what will be the direct impact on the IC&I property managers' day-to-day operations with the new act?
Well, I'll try to answer this one, Ange. Offhand, I don't know that there's going to be a direct impact. The legislation applies to producers, and it places requirements on the producers. How those producers then choose to meet their requirements, it may mean new contracts, or it may mean new a slightly different way of collecting material, and that might, it might mean that individual contractors or individual property managers, instead of paying for diversion, may end up having diversion at low, no, or even it might even become a revenue stream for them.
Okay, great. And what is the projected diversion rate with the new act? Where's the plan forecast to go?
That's not straightforward because it really depends on the materials that we do add and what the scope of those materials are. Right now we're proposing to add IC&I, paper and packaging. That waste stream alone accounts for anywhere from 30 to 40% of the overall waste stream in the province. So just by tackling that material alone, we could increase diversion in the province significantly. It's always hard to say exactly how much, but quite a bit.
And then what would qualify as an approved waste hauler recycler? Like what certificates or other documents should a company be asking for to
Yeah, in the waste hauling business, up until a few years ago, everybody was required to have a certificate of approval. Those kind of morphed into what they now call an environmental compliance approval. But recently, we just passed regulations that allow non-hazardous waste haulers, which would typically be the waste streams that are covered by the 3 Rs. Those they can register online, and the confirmation that they are a registered hauler would be sufficient.
Okay. So the next question, are there any plans to reduce the threshold of the new act? So many office buildings are smaller than 10,000 square meters. How about adding parks, entertainment areas, and buildings?
Yeah, there's always been, and John, you can add to this, I mean, there's always been a lot of discussion on those thresholds, and I think, John, you mentioned earlier that part of the overall framework here is to review the 3 R strategies, the 3 Rs regulations, and I think that's exactly the type of thing that they would be looking at, new sectors, different thresholds.
That's right, Ange. The proposal right now is that we would begin a review of those regulations. I wouldn't want to prejudge what the outcome of those reviews might be, but it is entirely possible that the thresholds would change, yes.
But again, as I mentioned in my talk there, I mean, those are the regulated ones. It does make sense, and there's nothing stopping implementing these similar practices that are regulated for the large ones in the smaller sectors, in the smaller businesses.
Okay, so now how will this act be imposed on corporate buildings with tenants? Would recycling quotas be set for tenants on the building or as a building as a whole? Sorry.
Yeah, so again, I just wanted to, again, clarify maybe, I said it before, the legislation is intended to place requirements on producers of products, not on what we'll call the generator of the product, which is it's essentially how the current 3 R regulations are established. So this legislation is not and will not have any requirements directly on the generator of the waste.
Okay. So clear and colored plastic bags, wraps, represent a huge volume, especially in residential streams. Is there any program to add a diversion program within the Blue Box program to include plastic bags?
So plastic bags are normally captured under paper and packaging. And that, all I can say at this point is that they would be within potentially within the scope of either the Blue Box program when we transition to the new framework, or the IC&I paper and packaging requirements. But before we decide exactly what's included or what would be included in those regulations, we would consult to determine if it makes sense to include them in those regulations.
Okay. So we have another question here. The IC&I is at 11%, and that is poor. Is it small waste producers that are the problem, as most medium to large businesses do far better than 11%?
I think, we've had a very strong effort to enforce the 3 Rs regulations on the larger companies that are caught by that over the last I think we started in '07 to put a very strong effort towards it. So that's a good 6 years now of history. And I think, what we find that a lot of, when we've looked at the companies out there and even done some resweeping of ones, inspected them later, we're finding that they are implementing source separation programs, and where they fall short is on the paperwork side of redoing their waste audits annually and their waste reduction work plans, but they do have established programs. I did speak to the benefits of annual review of those things. It does improve the program, but most of the companies do have some form of source separation program for the required materials. So, I think the answer to the question is the large companies are, for the most part, doing a certain job. Could they do better? Yes. And, I think the focus is on a lot of the smaller businesses. There's many more smaller businesses than large ones, and they're contributing to the low diversion rates.
Okay, so I do recognize that we're at 2:01 p.m. We do have a few more questions. Are you okay just to stay for an extra 10 minutes to cover these?
I'm okay with that. Sure.
Yeah. Okay, great. Perfect. So is there any interest in standardizing how to recycle so that there is seamless transition from residential to business across the province, implementing framework for all entities rather than relying on the industry, such as haulers, to set programs like single stream versus multi-stream and various acceptance criteria? That's a long question.
So I think this is referring to the new framework. And so the only real thing I can say at this point, because we haven't put the specific requirements in place, but again, the requirements will be on the producer to put in place their own diversion systems. The requirements will not be on haulers or waste management companies or the ultimate waste generator. So it would really depend on what system the producer wants to put in place.
Okay.
I think I've answered that question.
Okay. So we have another long question, so I'm going to try to do this in two parts. So many challenges faced with the current legislation come from a lack of enforcement within the IC&I sector. How would this enforcement issue be addressed under the new framework?
So under the new framework, and I don't want to repeat it over and over again, but again, the enforcement, the requirements and the enforcement would be on the producer.
Okay.
However, the 3R regulations work at the back end, and those requirements are on the generator of the waste, provided they meet the threshold. So ultimately, when we do the review of the 3R's regulations, we're going to see how and if there are any changes needed to the 3R's regulations to support increased diversion, and we may need to make some changes to those regulations.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add on that part as well. I mean, I know historically these regulations came, the current 3R's regulations came on the books in '94, I believe. And yes, the ministry was a little slow in enforcing those regulations for a number of years. But I would say that the enforcement over the last number of years has been fairly strong. We've inspected thousands and thousands of companies now and made them come into compliance, producing waste audits, waste reduction work plans, and source separating the materials. So, since 2007, we've had a dedicated team of 10 officers out there doing it. We're getting to the point where we're visited most of the very large facilities, and we're kind of, challenging ourselves to find new ones that are caught by the regulations. So, I think the enforcement on the large ones is fairly good now. We did start very slowly as a ministry in '94, but I think it's fairly good now, and I think we need to look at the review of the 3Rs to see where we want to take it. And I would assume that with any new regulations or any changed regulations, we always develop a compliance strategy up front before we launch these regulations.
Okay, so this is part two to that question. So the current or proposed legislation does not seem to provide a scaled solution that addresses both large producers and the SME segment. The type of solution that is simple would be a landfill tax that would address this. Why is such a complex approach being taken, in particular when the timelines for implementations are so long, particularly for organic wastes?
So yeah, that's a loaded question. As I mentioned near the end of my talk, we have heard a lot. We have gotten a lot of feedback on moving more quickly on a strategy for organics diversion, and I think that we will probably revisit or revise the time frame with respect to an organics diversion strategy. With respect to landfill levies, levies or taxes or that type of an approach, that's not. It's been considered, but that's not where the province wants to go. We're not certain that that is the right approach for the province, as it's a very blunt instrument. And while I'm not acknowledging that it might not help with diversion, trying to implement and enforce such a thing may not necessarily be the right approach when what we probably need to do is have a much more focused approach, which is what we're proposing right now.
Okay, thank you. So how will the proposed changes affect school boards? Will representative waste audits still be allowed?
I don't think the stuff that John has been talking about would get into that. Again, they're the generator of the materials. You know, our practice here is to be allowing school boards to use representative types of waste audits and waste reduction work plans, and then to factor in any changes that, you know, within the school boards. I understand some of them have, you know, cafeterias, some of them don't, so there's subtle changes, but using representative stuff, I think, has been our practice.
Okay.
Yeah. And I would just reiterate, yes, that's correct, Ange. There's nothing in this new legislation that would speak to individual generators such as school boards.
Okay, great. So is the legislation, does it work tandem with regulations 102, 103, and 104 and really not meant to replace those?
Well, at this time, the short answer is yes. It is intended to work in tandem with them. However, we do recognize, as Anne says, that those regulations are decades old, and so we are going to do a review to see if there's any elements that require changing, being brought up to, I guess, up to the current framework.
Okay. So what will the new authority do to ensure that the corporate sector of municipalities are aware of the new 3R regulations?
So again, I think this is a question that is more about maybe a bit of confusion with what the proposed new framework is about. It's not about the 3R regulations, and it's not about the generators or the waste companies that currently deal with the 3R regulations. Certainly, the consultation that we've had is broad. It's included all the affected stakeholders, but you know. It is not about the 3R's regulations.
Okay. So, you know, right now there are very few options to divert organics from the commercial sector. So why not ramp that as an action item rather than putting that on the long-term plan?
Sorry, can you repeat
So they're
that?
trying to see, like right now there's not many options to deal with organic waste in the commercial sector. So why in the proposed legislation would it be put on the long-term plan to deal with this?
The thinking with respect to creating a strategy and not doing it initially in the legislation is, or in the strategy is, first of all, the legislation itself is tailored toward products, and that there's a recognition that certain wastes, like organic waste, might not necessarily fit in or under the proposed legislation. There might need to be a different approach to deal with organics. So for that reason, we were proposing that we develop and consult on a strategy for dealing with organics, because it's not only a big part of the waste stream, it's also a fairly complicated and fairly expensive material to appropriately manage and divert. So that's why we had planned for it to take time. But like I said, we have been receiving a lot of feedback with respect to trying to speed that up, and we will consider whether we need to change the timelines.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. There are a few questions that we weren't able to cover, but I will be providing some contact information to those who can address those questions and get answers for them. I will be sending out all the materials with a recorded link and presentations by Monday. If you have any questions for me, you can always email me. And thank you so much, Ange and John, for joining us this afternoon and providing a great overview of what we currently have in Ontario's waste regulation and what's to come. Thank you so much again, and thank you for those wonderful questions.
Well, you're welcome, and it's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye now.